Hey guys, what's up? So I mentioned the possibility of doing a video like this in my last video, and I actually got a lot of positive feedback about the idea, which encouraged me to step up and make this video. In fact, I had a few others I was working on. I've put those to the side. I decided to focus on this. I thought it'd be kind of timely and fun to talk about. So we're going to look at JeeNiNe, his play style. I think it's fair to say he's the best player in the game. You could certainly make arguments that there's other players, other duelists that are at least his equal. You could probably make the argument that there's other invaders that are about as good as he is, but I don't think anybody is as good across the board, both duels and invasions. I think that's part of what makes him special. And it's interesting to note that there's not many top duelists who also invade, and I may talk about that at a later point, but I'm not going to get into that today. I'm going to focus mostly on invasions. We're going to dabble in duels just a little bit, but I think primarily I want to focus on invasions. And I also want to thank JeeNiNe for his support on the channel generally, and then also specifically for this endeavor. I didn't want to take on a project like this without at least getting some approval from him. Not that, of course, I had to, but I just thought it was kind of like the polite thing to do. And to be clear, he hasn't seen any of this. He has no idea what I'm going to do with the footage. He has no idea what I'm going to talk about. So thanks for the support and the trust in making a video like this. So the goal in making a video like this is to see, of course, what can we learn from a top player like JeeNiNe? What can we maybe apply to our own play? Let's see what's there that's good that we can take. I typically have the attitude that if I'm doing something and he does something different, that what he's doing is probably more efficient, not guaranteed, but probably more efficient, and I should look further at my own gameplay. A lot of what he does is just, he spaces really well. He has really good timing, and of course, you can't really take anything away from that other than to go practice those same things yourself. There's no like magic bullet or anything that we're going to learn about, but there are some elements of his overall strategies and some of the ways he approaches melee combat that I think we can take and maybe apply immediately to our own gameplay. And of course, better players will already be doing a lot of these things, but I think for a lot of us, there's some obvious ways that we can improve. And I've also noticed, by the way, that it seems there's kind of two groups of players. There's one group who seems to kind of improve organically. They don't give the game a lot of thought. It just kind of comes naturally to them, and through playtime and repetition, they naturally get better. I am not one of those players. For years, really, I stagnated and I was a pretty bad player and just didn't improve a lot because a lot of these things aren't obvious to me. But it also comes from who you play against. If you play against top players, you have no choice but to improve. But if, like me, you invade, soul level 70 to 100, you're just never going to get pushed that hard to really, really improve. So to me, it takes a lot of thinking and analysis to really observe what things work and how I can apply those to my gameplay. And it also matters, I think, what your background is. If you come from a melee fighting game background, then a lot of these concepts are going to be really apparent to you right away. But if, like me, you have not, then you have to learn all of these ideas and concepts, and it definitely takes some time and some focused attention. So as I've watched JeeNiNe play, and I've watched a lot of his gameplay, especially in the course of making this video, I would say the one thing that becomes abundantly clear as sort of like the common thread that ties together everything that he does, he is extremely a safe player. He's extremely risk averse. And I want to talk about why that is and why that approach makes a lot of sense. And we're going to get into a lot of those details. But the first thing that makes sense about this, if you go to Vegas, let's say, and you're going to play a game where the odds are against you 55 to 45, you have a 45% chance of winning. And you have two approaches. Let's say that you have $100 to gamble, and you can either gamble it all at once, or you can gamble it in increments of $10. So you play the game 10 times with $10 each time. You are way, way, way better off gambling the money all at once rather than gambling it a piece at a time, because the law of large numbers takes effect, and the more times you gamble, the more likely it is that the house edge is going to come into play. So if what you're trying to do is maximize your winnings, then you definitely want to gamble it all at once. And if you think about a fighting game, JeeNiNe's better than all of his opponents, or 99.9% of his opponents. And so it makes sense to go for a safe, cautious approach where in the long run, your skill is going to win out. If you take chances or you let your opponents take chances, then you introduce variance and you introduce the chance that a worse player is going to beat you. So this keeping safe approach is something that permeates everything he does, and I want to talk about some of the ways in which we can see how he plays safe and how it affects his gameplay. So let's quickly dispatch with some of the more obvious elements. The first thing up is he, of course, keeps Tears of Denial on all of his builds, and I think that's pretty typical these days. It wasn't the case maybe 3 years ago, but everybody's really learned that it introduces a huge amount of safety and protection, especially against like one shots. It's well worth the stat investment. And of course, through ring swapping, you can mitigate a lot of the stat investment that's required. But 2 attunement slots and I believe 15 faith. Everybody has it on their builds for obvious reasons. Okay, the next thing up is he stays topped off all the time. And this is something I think the invasion community kind of gradually became aware of the importance of this. Previously in the early days, people were afraid of wasting Estus, and so they wouldn't Estus unless they absolutely needed to. Nowadays, it's way more common to go in the opposite direction. And of course, with Siegs, you can easily top yourself off without wasting an entire Estus. So Siegs have definitely played a role in keeping yourself topped off. And this is about risk mitigation, because the biggest threat to anybody invading at meta is the blender. I mean, every other risk pales in comparison. Getting parried is probably the second biggest risk, but still a far second from the first, which is the blender. So staying topped off helps ensure that if you get caught in a blender, you're giving yourself the greatest opportunity to escape and be able to heal up. And of course, with his newer light roll builds, which we'll talk about here in a moment, it also helps him out because of either the shield ring or the sword ring. And I know he's talked before about his choice on whether to use the shield ring and the sword ring. It depends in part on his build. I don't want to go into all those details now, but he puts a lot of thought into whether he uses the shield ring or the sword ring, which one's more likely to actually end up benefiting him. Also, when I say he tries to minimize risk, he does sometimes take chances, but that's usually in very controlled circumstances. So if you see him go for something like an unequipped parry, he will almost never do that when he's in a group of phantoms. He'll do it in one-on-one situations where even if he whiffs the parry, maybe loses all of his stamina, eats a bunch of damage, especially on his light roll build, he takes a lot of damage. Then he is able to still escape and kind of regroup. And then the risk, the consequences of a whiff parry are pretty minimal. You try to throw a parry out among a group of players and you're going to get caught in the blender. And this, by the way, is one of the big differentiating factors I see in his play versus others. Him really trying to work and minimize those risks. And I even hear him talk about it in his streams, where just the other day he was contemplating doing something risky. He decided against it because there were too many players around. A lot of times I watch other streamers, and these are the types of areas where they'll get themselves killed. They go for something risky, and sometimes it works out and it's really cool and flashy, but very often it doesn't, and it ends up getting them killed. So next up is JeeNiNe's light roll build, and this is really interesting to me because I know he started experimenting with this maybe 4 or 5 months ago, something like that. And light roll involves a number of very interesting trade-offs. Obviously, when he's hit, because he can't wear very good armor, he's going to take a lot more damage. And if you've watched him play, when he gets hit, he does take a lot of damage, which in some sense you would think is counterproductive, because we know the greatest risk is the blender. And if you're light rolling and you get caught in the blender, you're going to be taking a shit ton of damage. And I believe, though I'm not 100% certain, that you lose all your roll poise as well, which in some sense makes it more likely that you're going to get caught and get put in the blender. However, there's two opposing factors. So factor one is he does more damage because of his light roll and the Flynn's ring. And again, he stays topped off quite a bit, so he often has the sword ring proccing. But I think that's actually secondary. I don't think that's the most important part of his light roll build. The most important point of his light roll build is how far he can roll. Because when you get surrounded by a group of phantoms and they all start swinging, even if you reaction roll one of the swings, the chances that you come out of a roll and get hit by others and get put in the blender is so high that just this one factor alone, the longer rolls, so when the gank is spamming, the chances of him being able to roll out successfully are much higher. And it tells you just what a risk the blender is, that the fact that this one element, this ability to roll a little bit further and avoid those very often lucky attacks that the gank throws out, just that one factor alone makes that build so much more survivable. Even though intuitively you might not think of light roll as being about survivability, the way that he plays it, I believe that it is. Now, I could be wrong about this. He may think it's more about the damage, and if he sees this, I'd definitely be curious to hear his opinion. But that's really what I take away from the light roll build is it increases his survivability by enabling him to roll just a little bit further to escape the gank when they're mashing, when he's kind of surrounded. Now, when he's maybe trying to evade the gank and he's getting away, you can, of course, spam roll to get away faster than if you're medium rolling, then a medium rolling person can actually run. I don't think that actually comes into play very often because you're going to blow all your stamina. And if you want to be able to FAP glitch to get away, then you kind of can't be rolling. You have to just run and rely on having a lead of sorts and the FAP glitch in order to get away. So next up for risk mitigation, and this isn't entirely really a risk mitigation topic, but it's related, and that is rolling. Anybody who's invaded into ganks knows rolling in a gank against a gank is very, very difficult. It's incredibly difficult. And I think this is actually one area where a lot of experience, it really matters. You watch JeeNiNe play and he seems to almost have a sixth sense about where everyone is, and he does an excellent job of camera management. But at the end of the day, when you fight ganks, there's always going to be times where you aren't always going to be able to see what you need to see. Sometimes you need to be looking in two different directions at once when you get surrounded, again, which is actually one of the reasons why he's so good at even not being in that situation to begin with. But when you are, you can't always reaction roll. And I know as I was improving, I had this kind of mindset for a while, like I'm always going to reaction roll. I'm always going to work. At least that was the goal. I'm going to always have the goal of reaction rolling the gank's attacks, but pretty quickly you realize that simply isn't possible. You can't always be looking in the right direction to reaction roll, which means you have to use predictive rolls. And panic rolling is really just a form of predictive rolling. It's the worst kind because it's just mashing. JeeNiNe doesn't do that. At least not very often. Sometimes he does, but it's always a choice. It's never something that he just does mindlessly. Of course, like anyone, he makes mistakes. He sometimes panic rolls when he shouldn't, but in general, his rolling is a really interesting mix of reaction rolling and then identifying those situations in which he really can't reaction roll. And in that case, you have to go for your best guess. And he seems to do an excellent job of making educated guesses as to when he should roll. Of course, the light roll build helps out here and is definitely more tolerant of rolling mistakes. And I've seen other players who light roll who I think when they get surrounded by a gank, they just mash roll. And with a normal build, that might not be a good choice, but with a light roll build, it seems it often is a good choice to just kind of mash roll. Not that JeeNiNe does that. He seems to really mix those up, and he adapts well in the sense that when he's on his light roll build, he can afford to predictive roll more often than maybe when he's on his like his lap build, for example. Next up, I want to talk about some of like the evolution in his gameplay and the kind of impact he's had on the game. And I think if you look, there was actually a comment thread on one of his videos recently where somebody said, hey, I think has JeeNiNe improved recently? And to me, and I think I left a comment to this effect, the answer is most definitely. And watching his clips, from 6 months ago, a year, 2 years ago, to me, I can definitely see a huge amount of improvement. But not just improvement, a lot of changes in tactics and strategy. It was actually funny, I was watching a clip of his from like 2 years ago and I saw him soft swapping to Corvian, and I'd forgotten that was something he used to do, and of course now he just hard swaps. He's also been a big innovator in the dueling scene. I think he's brought a lot of the elements of invasions, especially things that might be attributed to like swappers. He's brought a lot of those techniques into even the dueling world. Of course, he employs them in invasions, but I was really struck when I first started watching him, even as a duelist, things like backstabs he uses much more often than typical duelists would. Like going for pivot stabs specifically, you don't see that very often among other duelists. Going for parries, you don't see that very often. And then like his strategic hard swaps, like Gundyrs to punish wake-ups, Lidos to bait poise trades, followers to go for guard breaks. These are the sorts of things that you never used to see in the dueling world. And I think he made some big changes there, and I think a lot of other duelists have had to adapt to kind of keep up with him. And of course, he uses these same tactics in invasions. And I think he's really changed the invasion meta. And of course, it's not just him. There's been other players that have contributed, but I think he's probably been the most identifiable. And if you looked at, let's say, Pontiff invasions from 2 years ago and compared them to now, they're completely different. And I think he's a huge reason for that. You know, he's demonstrated on stream after stream just how effective these tactics are. And I know he's certainly caused me to change the way that I play, and I've tried to incorporate more of these into my own gameplay because I've fought against these tactics and I know just how effective that they are. Okay, so next up, I want to talk about one of JeeNiNe's approaches to melee combat that I find really striking, and that is that he seems to make the assumption that his opponents are capable, and he always starts from this default assumption, and it really infects his gameplay, and it's especially apparent when he plays Curved Sword. I want to dive into some of these details about what I mean. So if you have a Curved Sword and you have an opponent in front of you, the typical approach might be to go for 2 R1s and then wait and kind of see what happens. Is your opponent going to panic roll? If so, you can go to do a roll catch. But the problem with this approach is that if you hit them twice and then you go for a read, the number of options your opponent has at this point are pretty limitless. You know, the hit stun's quick, so they can go for a parry after the second R1. They might go for a backstab. They might roll. They might attack. They might go for a charged R2. They might swap weapons. You really don't know. And then you suddenly find yourself in a spot where you've got to deal with a lot of choices that your opponent has. If instead you do something like, let's say, staggered R1s, then you mitigate a lot of that risk. Now, what's interesting is if you start thinking about specific cases, like let's say I'm up against somebody, I'm using a Curved Sword, and I know, let's just say for whatever reason, I know that there's a 90% chance that they're going to panic roll after an R1, and maybe it's a staggered R1. Let's just say staggered R1. So I'm going to stagger my R1s, and I think there's a 90% chance that my opponent's going to panic roll. Well, if that's the case and I'm trying to maximize damage, then the smart thing to do would be R1, wait for the panic roll, and then R1 again, and that's going to maximize damage. However, it also increases risk, because if I'm wrong about that and I go for that roll catch and they parry, or maybe they attack with a poised weapon, or they're latent and they attack with even a non-poised weapon and I end up trading, there's more risk with that approach. So JeeNiNe tends to really favor the staggered R1s with the Curved Sword, even though he very often will see his opponent panic roll, panic roll, panic roll, and so he'll whiff that second R1. But what it does is it minimizes the risk both of parries, and it minimizes the risk that his opponent can do something out of hit stun where he's going to end up trading, and especially against a hyper armor weapon, losing that trade. And so you can see again this idea of safety and risk mitigation, trying to minimize risk. He ends up trading damage very often for the opportunity to minimize risk, which again, if you're the better player, definitely makes sense. And the more better you are, the more that the strategy makes sense. It's the opposite of what I've talked about in my parry videos. If you're the worst player, then it makes a lot of sense to go for parries and criticals because you're probably going to lose anyway, so why not go for something that has a shot at winning the fight for you straight away? The better you are than your opponent, the less strategies like that make sense, and the more you're better off going with a more conservative and safety-oriented fighting approach. Okay guys, well that's it. I had actually planned originally to go into more details about some of his specific fighting techniques, but this video is already sprawling to begin with. I thought about breaking this up into a multiple series of videos, but I think that would just be a bit too much. Maybe at some later point I'll go into some more of the details in specific fights and matchups, because there's a lot of interesting things there to talk about, but I think this is going to have to suffice for now. So thanks to everybody who sat through this. I really appreciate the support. Thanks again to JeeNiNe. Thanks everyone. Have a great day and take care of yourself.